Aeneas. Aeneas does not get an ending. Not really. Virgil spends an entire epic building him into Rome's sacred ancestor, the man who carried his father out of burning Troy, who survived shipwreck, heartbreak, and a descent into the underworld, who finally defeats his last enemy on Italian soil, and then the poem simply stops. No death scene. No final breath. The most important man in Roman mythology exits his own story mid-victory. What happened to him afterward was left to other, less careful writers. Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus both claim he died near a river called the Numicus, not long after that final battle, but neither one commits to how. One version has him drowning in the fighting, another says his body was never recovered at all. For most people, a missing body would raise questions. For Rome, it settled them. No corpse meant no ordinary death, so the Romans decided he hadn't died at all. He had dissolved into the land itself, absorbed into divinity, worshipped afterward as a local god named Jupiter Indiges, his shrine placed near the very river that may have swallowed him. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Rome's founding father doesn't get a grave. He gets a disappearing act dressed up as an ascension. And once you notice that pattern here at the very beginning, it becomes hard to unsee it in everything that follows, because Aeneas is not the last Roman hero whose death conveniently turns into something else entirely. The next one isn't even mythical. He's the king who built the city, and his own senate may have had a hand in how he left it. Before Romulus was a king, he was one half of an argument that ended in murder. He and his twin brother Remus had agreed to found a city together, but they couldn't agree on whose name it would carry or who had the right to rule it. So they turned to the sky for an answer. Each brother stood on his own hill and watched for vultures. Remus on the Aventine counted 6, Romulus on the Palatine counted 12. Romulus claimed the omen favored him and began marking out the boundary of his new city with a plow. Remus wasn't convinced or didn't care. Looking at his brother's half-finished wall at this point, barely more than a shallow trench, he jumped over it. It was less an obstacle than an insult, a way of showing exactly how little that boundary meant to him. Romulus killed him for it. Some accounts say he did it himself, others say he ordered a man named Celer to do it instead. Either way, the line attributed to him afterward was short, and it stuck. Whoever else tries to cross these walls will meet the same end. So Rome's first act as a city wasn't a celebration, it was a burial. And later Roman writers never quite made peace with that fact for centuries. They'd return to Remus whenever they wanted to argue that something violent had been built into Rome's foundations, from day one, something no law or virtue could fully undo. Romulus, meanwhile, kept ruling. For 37 years, in fact, right up until the day he vanished during a storm, with no body left behind to explain how. By the end of his reign, Romulus had changed. The soldier king who founded Rome had grown, in Livy's telling increasingly autocratic, the kind of ruler even his own supporters had started to find difficult to live under. Then, during a military review on the Campus Martius, the sky turned violent. A sudden dense storm rolled over the assembled soldiers, thick enough that no one could see more than a few feet ahead. When it finally cleared, Romulus was simply gone. No blood, no body. No one who could say with any confidence what had actually happened in those few minutes of darkness. The Senate moved fast to supply an answer. Romulus's divine father Mars, they announced, had descended and carried his son up into the heavens, where he now reigned as a new god, Quirinus. Shortly afterward, a man named Julius Proculus came forward with a vision Romulus had appeared to him. He claimed larger than life and glowing, instructing the Roman people to worship him from now on. The timing was remarkable. The story closed every open question at once. Livy, writing centuries later, records the official account but not without a noticeably dry aside. Some people, he notes, believed the senators had murdered Romulus themselves during the cover of that storm, torn his body apart, and smuggled the pieces out beneath their togas. It's not an unreasonable theory. He'd been growing harder to work with. They had the motive, the opportunity, and, conveniently, a vision waiting in the wings to shut down further questions. Rome chose to believe in the god instead. Whether that was faith or simply the safer story to tell is something the Romans were careful never to settle out loud. Not every disputed death in Roman history was this politically convenient, though. Sometimes the disagreement was simpler to historians, just watching the same man die two different ways. In 508 BCE, the Etruscan king Porsena marched his army toward Rome, and only one thing stood between him and the city: a wooden bridge over the Tiber. A soldier named Horatius Cocles decided to hold that bridge alone. While his men tore the structure down plank by plank behind him, he stood at the far end and fought off wave after wave of Etruscan attackers, buying just enough time for the engineers to finish their work. When the last support finally gave way and the bridge collapsed into the river, Horatius was still standing on the wrong side of it. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. Livy says Horatius, still in full armor, prayed to the river god and swam to safety while the crowd on the Roman bank erupted in relief. Polybius, writing with far less patience for heroic embellishment, says the weight of that same armor dragged him straight under and he drowned before he ever reached the shore. Rome didn't wait for the two accounts to agree. They built him a bronze statue in the Comitium, the civic heart of the city, and granted him as much farmland as he could plow in a single day. If Polybius had it right, that statue stood for a man who died holding a bridge Rome had just finished destroying, which is either deeply honorable or grimly ironic, depending on how you want to read it. Either way, the message Rome wanted told was more important than which version was true. And the next hero on this list understood that lesson better than anyone because his legend wasn't built on winning a fight at all. It was built on how convincingly he could suffer through one. While Porsena's army still camped outside Rome, a young Roman named Gaius Mucius decided the fastest way to end the siege was to walk into the enemy camp and kill the king himself. Getting in wasn't the hard part. Disguised as an ordinary soldier, he slipped through easily enough and found the raised platform where he assumed Porsena would be seated. He stabbed the man closest to it without hesitating. It wasn't Porsena. It was the king's secretary who happened to be sitting in the place of honor that day. Mucius was seized immediately and dragged before the king he'd failed to kill. Porsena demanded to know who had sent him and how many more were coming. Mucius gave him nothing useful. Instead, to make his point a different way, he reached his right hand into the nearest brazier of burning coals and held it there, without flinching, without making a sound. Then he told Porsena there were 300 more Romans exactly like him, each one waiting for their own chance. It wasn't true, but Porsena, by most accounts, was genuinely shaken enough to believe it. He released Mucius and agreed to open negotiations for peace. Mucius walked out of that camp with his right hand destroyed, and a new surname for the rest of his life, Scavula, meaning left-handed. He survived, which in some ways is the more remarkable outcome. Rome had just watched a failed assassination attempt end a siege not through violence, but through a single deliberate act of self-destruction sold as proof of unlimited resolve. It worked, and once that idea took hold that dying, or offering to die, could be a weapon in itself, one Roman family took it further than anyone. They turned it into a ritual and performed it twice, a generation apart. The devotio was one of Rome's strangest religious rituals, simple in concept, terrifying in practice. When a battle was going badly enough, a Roman consul could ritually dedicate his own life to the gods of the underworld in exchange for victory. He'd veil his head, recite the formula, mount his horse, and ride alone into the enemy line, seeking death as quickly and deliberately as possible. Publius Decius Mus did this at the Battle of Vesaris in 340 BCE. He performed the ritual, rode into the Latin ranks, and was killed. Rome won. 45 years later, at Sentinum in 295 BCE, his son performed the exact same ritual against a combined Gallic and Samnite force, and was also killed. Rome also won. 2 generations, the same family, the same deliberate death, treated by ancient writers not as suicidal despair, but as a genuine act of religious power. Not every world-changing death in Rome's story was a battlefield sacrifice, though. Some came from a much smaller, crueler room. Lucretia was raped by Sextus Tarquinius, son of Rome's king, who threatened to destroy her reputation if she ever spoke of it. She reported it anyway to her father, to her husband, in front of witnesses, made them swear vengeance, and then took her own life before their eyes. Livy gives her a single precise line: no unchaste woman would ever use her, as precedent. Her death didn't just end in grief, it ended a monarchy. The outrage it sparked drove the king from Rome entirely and gave birth to the Republic. 2 forms of sacrifice separated by centuries, one chosen to win a battle, one forced by violence and turned into a revolution. Between them, they raise an uncomfortable question: how much of Rome's survival was actually built on people choosing, or being forced to disappear? After all of that, the ambiguous deaths, the ritual suicides, the burned hands and collapsed bridges, Rome's story ends, for our purposes, with a man who didn't die at all. Not for a while anyway, and not in any way worth dwelling on. In 458 BCE, a farmer named Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus was working his small plot of land on the far bank of the Tiber when the Senate's envoys arrived to tell him he'd been appointed dictator, Rome's highest emergency power, handed to one man in a crisis. He asked them to wait while he put on his toga. Then he defeated the Aequi in a campaign that lasted 15 days, held his triumph, and resigned the dictatorship. He went back to farming. Decades later, Rome called on him again reportedly when he was around 80 years old to deal with a man named Spurius Maelius, accused of reaching for the kind of power kings once held. Cincinnatus handled it, then he resigned a second time and went home again. He died old on his own farm, with no storm, no ambush, no disputed river crossing. Nothing about his death made it into legend. What made it into legend was what he kept giving back. That's the thing worth sitting with after everyone else on this list. Rome didn't just celebrate people who died well, it celebrated more rarely, someone who held real power twice and simply chose twice not to keep it. In a city built on a murdered brother, a possibly murdered king, and deaths turned into propaganda. The strangest ending of all might be the one where a man just walks back to his field and nobody has to argue about what really happened to him. If you want more stories like this, the ones history tried to smooth over there is another one waiting on screen now.